Hello, it's Alexander Hagberg here for Team X-Ray, and today I'm gonna show to you my recommended essential spare parts for the X12'22, which I have in front of me. What parts are important to keep in your bag when you go racing, for what reason, what parts can break on the car from having a crash, and what parts do I recommend to keep for simple maintenance of the car. Let's start and present these parts, and I'm gonna explain to you the reason for why I've chosen those. I'm gonna start with the rear pod lower plate, which is the aluminum version, which is standard on the EU and US versions of the kits. This is also available in carbon fiber if you purchase the optional carbon fiber chassis and rear pod. But for the standard kits, this is the standard part, the aluminum part. So why do I recommend to keep this as a spare? Because if you have a big crash, it can bend the rear pod because it's quite thin in the area around the motor here. So sometimes it can bend and it can tweak the car. But if you have a big crash, make sure that you loosen all these screws to straighten everything out and reset the screws to look for any tweak. But in case the crash was big and you cannot make this flat and the rear pod is tweaked, you take this off the car, you put it on the board and it's rocking, like it's not sitting flat on the board. It's time to replace it. So I recommend keeping this as a spare so that you don't have to run the car with a bent pod plate because it can really affect the handling negatively. So that's part number one. I'm gonna put this here, up in the corner. And let's move on to the front bumper plate. It's also made of graphite material. As I've shown in my build video and as I've recommended, you can glue the edges of this bumper with CA glue to reinforce it and to prevent delamination in case of a crash. So that's something I really recommend doing. This sometimes is still not enough. You can still break the bumper in case of a crash. Actually, the main purpose of the bumper is to protect the car in a frontal crash. So if the bumper breaks, usually means that the chassis is not bent and it's still in one piece. So the bumper has done its job. So I recommend keeping this as a spare, because even though we have a front foam bumper on top of it, which also absorbs a lot of the impact normally in a crash, you can still break this part sometimes. The little countersunk screws here can sometimes rip through the graphite and it can break the bumper. So graphite bumper, important to keep as a spare. Just gonna put this here. And next part, another graphite part. It's the front lower arm. The front lower arm has been not a weak point, but it's been a part of the car that can break in the past, and it's been reinforced a little bit for the X12'22. We have steel plates now that mount onto the arm from the bottom, which definitely reinforces the front arm and makes it less prone to breaking in a crash. As I've shown in my build video, I recommend gluing the edges of the front arm to stop it from breaking and delaminating in a crash. But even though you've done that, if you have a really bad hit, sometimes you can break this part. So I recommend keeping a spare in your pit bag. As you can see, on this car we have the reinforcement plates here on the front arms, which they really helps to save the arm in certain crashes. But still, I recommend to keep this with you. So these two parts, front steering blocks, they are made of a plastic composite graphite material. So that means that they're made out of a bit of graphite into the plastic composite mixture to not only be a bit more rigid, but also to give less friction for the front kingpin. But having that graphite added to them makes them a bit more fragile than a fully plastic steering block would be. So in a hard crash, they can break. I've never broken one personally, but I've seen it happen before, so it's definitely possible to break these. So I recommend keeping those as spares. They're plastic parts, quite low in cost, so not really a big worry if you break one, but they are definitely one of the parts that will break first in a crash. So we got these rear pod bulkheads in aluminum, of course, which they are pinned to the lower pod plate to keep them in place, keep them straight, and to avoid tweak in a crash. But if you have a bad hit, if you get hit from behind, for example, or if you get thrown into a wall at some point, these can bend. They are pretty strong, but I've seen them bend before. So those are also important spare parts in case you need to do a full rebuild after a big crash. What you need to do is, after a big crash, you take the pod out of the car, the rear pod, and disassemble the rear pod, put the aluminum parts on the board as well as the lower pod plate. Check if they're flat. If not, you'll need to replace them. Spur gears. These are actually some of the cheapest spares that you can keep in your pit bag, but probably some of the most important ones too, because it's very easy to strip a spur gear, especially when you're running a solid axle in the rear. Can happen from a crash, can happen from you setting the gear mesh not in a proper way, and for different reasons why the spur gear can break, basically. So always keep spares, and you might want to order different sizes as well if you want to fine-tune your gear ratio and the rollout of the car. So this is the 80-tooth spur gear, which is standard in the EU version of the car. The 76-tooth spur gear, which is standard in the US version of the car. So spur gears, very important. Last but not least, bearings. So bearings can break in a crash, but they're not that likely to break. I mainly keep these in my pit bag for maintenance. So I try to replace these when they go gritty, when they're not smooth and free. And even though you keep adding oil to these, eventually they will not be good anymore and you'll need to throw them out and put new ones in. So the front wheel bearings, 2 on each side, they don't really break, they just wear out over time normally. Or in case you lose one, in case you forgot to tighten the wheel nut or something. And the rear axle bearings, which they're a bit more fragile than the front bearings. They can break, they can fall apart if you have a crash, if you get hit from the side. But with the plastic rear ride height axle holders that we have now, they usually last a lot longer. But you should still keep some as spares in your pit bag for the sake of maintenance, but also in case that you break one. Those are all the essential spare parts for the X12'22 that I recommend to keep in your pit bag at all times. Most of them are pretty cheap parts, but some of them are a bit more costly, but in case of a big crash, it's nice to have spare parts at hand in case there's no hobby shop available at your track, and just in general so that you don't have to stop racing in the middle of your race day. And I hope that this video was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.